Comic books in the 1970s began to shift in thematic focus. In the decades prior, stories leaned more towards the exuberant, with the whole concept of superheroes being shown in a sensationalized way. Characters, costumes, abilities, it was all dramatized and shown as larger than life. Like many art forms in the 1970s, comics began to reflect the civil unrest found within society at the time. Campaigns for change were happening all across North America, and social progressive values, such as racial equality, feminism, and the war on drugs, were just some of the many social issues brought up and discussed during this time. The name given to this era in comics is the Bronze Age, but I like to think of it as the age shit got real. Now, the fantastical elements from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s were still present in superhero stories, don't get me wrong, but now they were dealing with problems society was facing too, depicting things that would have been viewed as untouchable in the decades prior. The stories themselves began to include darker imagery and ideas as well, centering around death and loss. The heroes weren't always victorious. In many ways, comics were becoming more grounded and realistic. Writers and artists were able to get away with so much more than they could before. Today, let's count down the top 5 best comic characters to come out of the 1970s. If I missed any of your favorites or ones you believe should have been on my list, be sure to leave them in the comments section down below. Starting the list off at number 5 is Swamp Thing, one of my favorite DC superheroes. I love this guy, or I guess, thing. Swamp Thing was a scientist named Alec Holland, who was working on a biorestorative formula within a secret facility located in the Louisiana swamplands. A bomb planted by criminals explodes and causes a fire in the facility. Holland is covered in his own formula and runs into the swamp to put out the flames. Instead, the chemicals react with the swamp's plant life, combining it with Holland's consciousness and memories. It forms a new being, a kind of swamp monster that fights for not only his boggy home, but the Earth's environment in general. Swamp Thing is such a lovable character in my opinion. His natural, peaceful demeanor, unless provoked of course, is admirable, and his want to save the environment, I mean, come on, that's nice of him. His introduction came at a time when the Comics Code Authority began to weaken, and stories involving monsters and the supernatural were becoming popular once again. For number 4, I chose the hero for hire, Luke Cage, also known as Power Man, that debuted in June of 1972. Though Black Panther had made his first appearance for Marvel in 1966, and is widely considered to be the first mainstream superhero of African descent, Luke Cage was the first black superhero to be the title character of his own comic book. Black Panther didn't get his own series until 1977. Luke Cage debuted during the height of blaxploitation films in the 1970s that began portraying black characters as central protagonists as opposed to villains and sidekicks like they had been depicted as countless times before. Luke Cage stories centered on the streets, depicted a crime-heavy New York City, discussed race relations, and even the war on drugs. They had a lot to say at the time, and the character has managed to evolve along with society over the years, and it makes sense. At number 3 we have Frank Castle, the Punisher. He's notable in that he redefined what a superhero could be. He was an entirely new breed. Motivated by the death of his family, he would use his military background and skills to torture, kidnap, murder, and extort his enemies. The Punisher doesn't play by the rules of your typical hero, and it's for that reason that he really isn't one, more of an anti-hero than anything. In his original stories, Frank Castle was depicted as a Vietnam War veteran and debuted in comics a little over a year before the conflict ended. So guns, violence, war, peace, it was all in the minds of Americans at that time and would have planted the seeds for this kind of character. At number 2 we have Ra's al Ghul, another character that fights for the environment, sort of like Swamp Thing, wanting balance, but is willing to exterminate the majority of humanity to accomplish it. Debuting in June of 1971, Ra's al Ghul has become one of Batman's most prominent enemies, leading the terrorist group known as the League of Assassins, or League of Shadows, or Society of Shadows, depending on what story or adaptation you're looking at. He's just a great character, and if you want more info on him, as well as my own thoughts on him, check out my breakdown I did a while back. Before we get to my number 1, here are some honorable mentions. Darkseid, the ruler of Apocalypse, who debuted in 1970, Man-Thing, and Morbius the Living Vampire from 1971, Ghost Rider in 1972, Blade, Howard the Duck, and Thanos making their first appearances in 1973, Iron Fist in 1974, Moon Knight and Captain Canuck in 1975, Bullseye and Jigsaw in 1976, Sabretooth and 2000 AD's Judge Dredd from 1977, Mystique in 1978, and finally, Black Cat from Spider-Man in 1979. As you can see, there was quite a bit from this decade, and all of them are memorable in their own ways. But without a doubt, my number 1 pick for best comic character from the 1970s decade would have to be Wolverine from the X-Men. Much like Punisher, he emerged from the ashes of the Vietnam War, and there was now an interest in these types of brutal, anti-heroic characters within North American comics. Wolverine is one of the most popular and recognizable characters in comic book history. He deserves the top spot on this list for that reason alone, but he's also one of the more notable Canadian characters as well, which gets him a few extra brownie points for me too. So that's my list, guys. Again, if I missed any of your favorites or characters I should have mentioned created during the 1970s decade, be sure to leave them in the comments section down below. I want to thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon to be notified of all future content I release on here. Also, you can help support me on Patreon, and I've got a bi-weekly podcast I upload on YouTube as well if you want to check that out. Take care, guys, and I will see all of you in the next one.